Some stories are better heard with someone else. But you're here alone. Welcome to Don't Listen Alone. This is 100% ad-free, just you and whatever comes next. Drop your location and the time before we begin. Now, listen carefully. Not everything you hear is part of the story. I had never experienced anything like that before, and even now, when I think back on it, I still remember every part of it with a strange kind of clarity. It was one of those moments that feels short while it is happening, but later it stretches in your mind and seems much longer. At the time, it was just early morning, and I had been asleep like any other night. Nothing about the night felt different before it happened. Nothing felt unusual when I went to sleep. I was not expecting anything strange, and I had never had an experience like this before, which is probably why it stayed with me so strongly. It was not something I had prepared for, and it was not something I could explain away easily once it was over. I had been dreaming before I woke up. It was not even an important dream, just one of those random dreams that do not seem to make much sense while they are happening. In the dream, I was in my car, but I was not driving. Someone else was driving it. The strange part was that I had never met that person before, at least not in real life. It was not a friend, not a family member, not anyone I recognized. It was just some unknown person driving my car while I was there with them. There was nothing especially frightening about the dream from what I remember. It was just odd, the kind of dream that feels normal while you are in it even though it makes no sense once you wake up. Then something happened that pulled me out of sleep. I heard a female voice say my name. That was what woke me. At least that is how it felt. Even now, I still go back and forth in my mind about whether the voice was part of the dream or whether it happened outside the dream and actually woke me up. In the moment, it felt real. It did not sound far away. It did not sound like the sort of voice you hear in dreams where everything feels blurred and distant. It sounded close, clear, and direct. It only said my name one time. It was not drawn out. It was not whispered in a creepy way. It was just short, almost quick, like someone trying to get my attention. The tone was not angry, and it was not sweet either. It was just a woman's voice saying my name as if she wanted me to wake up and notice. The second I heard it, I woke fully. That is one of the reasons why the whole thing felt so strange to me later. I did not wake slowly. I was not half asleep for a long time. It felt like I went from being asleep and dreaming to being instantly awake and aware. I opened my eyes and immediately started looking around my room. I moved my head from side to side, trying to figure out where the voice had come from. My first reaction was not terror. It was confusion. I was trying to place the sound in my mind and understand why I had heard it. I turned my head to the left first because that was the direction the voice seemed to come from. It had sounded like it was somewhere off to my left side, so that was where I looked. But there was nothing there. I did not see anyone. I did not see any movement. The room looked normal, at least at first. I was lying in bed, awake, looking into the dim early morning light of my room, trying to understand what had just happened. For a second, I probably thought maybe it had just been part of the dream after all. Maybe my mind had carried a sound over into waking. Maybe I was more asleep than I realized. Then I turned my head to the right. That was when everything changed. As soon as I looked to the right, I saw what looked like a shadow come across me and pin me down. That is the only way I can describe it, because even now I do not know what else to call it. It did not look solid like a person. It did not have clear features. It was just dark, like a shadow, but it was shaped in a way that made it seem like something was there. It was angled as if it were standing beside my bed and leaning over me. From the way it looked, it seemed like it had reached one arm across each of my shoulders, pressing me down into the bed. Its head was very close to mine, almost face to face with me. It felt like it had moved into position instantly, or maybe it was already there and I only saw it when I turned my head that way. I do not know which is worse to think about. The thing itself had no real face that I could make out. There were no eyes that I could clearly see, no mouth, no nose, nothing defined. Its body was the same. It was not detailed. It did not look like a normal human body standing in the room. It was just dark, like a shape made out of shadow. But even without features, it still felt like a presence. It still felt like something was there over me. That was what made it so terrifying. If it had only been a patch of darkness in the room, maybe I could have dismissed it more easily. But it looked arranged in a way that made it feel alive, or at least aware of me. Its head was moving rapidly. That part stayed with me more than anything else. The head was moving up and down quickly toward my face and then back again. It was not slow and smooth. It was quick, repeated movement, like it was jerking toward me and away from me over and over. It did not touch my face, at least I do not think it did, but it came very close. It felt invasive. It felt threatening. Even though it had no visible expression, the way it moved made it seem intense and unnatural. If it had been still, it might have been frightening enough, but that rapid movement made it so much worse. It turned the whole thing from strange into terrifying. I tried to move. Nothing happened. That was the moment real panic hit me. Until then, I had only been shocked by what I was seeing. But as soon as I tried to move and realized I could not, everything became much more frightening. I wanted to pull away. I wanted to lift my arms. I wanted to jerk my shoulders, roll over, sit up, anything. But my body would not respond. I was fully aware of what was happening around me, but I could not move a muscle. It felt like I was trapped inside myself while this thing hovered over me. I tried to scream too. But all that came out were weak sounds, little moans or grunts. I could not form words. I could not yell. It was like the effort to scream got stuck somewhere inside me, and only the smallest sound could escape. That may have scared me almost as much as being unable to move. There is something deeply terrifying about wanting to call for help and realizing your voice will not work. You start to feel helpless in a way that is hard to describe unless you have experienced it. You know what you want your body to do, and your body simply does not obey. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 seconds. At least that is what it felt like afterward. In the moment, it could have been shorter or longer. Time feels different when you are in fear. A few seconds can feel stretched out because your mind is trying to process too much too quickly. All I know is that it did not last for very long in normal time, but it lasted long enough for me to see it clearly, long enough for me to try to move, long enough for me to try to make noise, and long enough for me to feel completely trapped. At one point I squeezed my eyes shut. I do not know if I did it out of fear or instinct. I think I just did not want to see it anymore. I remember shutting my eyes tightly and trying as hard as I could to break free. I was desperate to move. I was desperate for it to stop. I believe that while my eyes were closed, I may have turned my head to the left. That is what it felt like afterward, although I cannot say it with complete certainty. The memory of those few seconds is sharp in some ways and blurred in others. But I do remember the feeling of forcing my eyes shut and trying to pull away from whatever was over me. Then it was gone. When I opened my eyes again, the shadow was no longer there. The pressure, or at least the feeling of being held down, was gone too. I could move again. Just like that, it was over. There was no slow fading. There was no final movement. It was simply there one moment, and gone the next. I was left lying in bed, suddenly free to move, breathing hard, and trying to understand what had just happened. The strange thing is that right after it ended, I was not scared in the same way. For a brief moment, I felt more shocked than frightened. I was sitting in the aftermath of it, almost stunned, trying to process whether it had really happened. The immediate terror eased as soon as I could move again. Maybe it was because the danger felt gone. Maybe it was because my mind had not yet caught up with what I had experienced. There was a pause where I just lay there, awake and thinking, and it was only after I started going over it in my mind that the fear really came back. That was when I started thinking about every detail. I thought about the female voice saying my name. I thought about how awake I had felt when I looked around the room. I thought about the shadow shape leaning over me. I thought about the arms across my shoulders. I thought about the head moving up and down toward my face. I thought about being unable to move and unable to scream. And the more I thought about all of it, the more shaken I became. It is one thing to feel terror while something is happening. It is another thing to lie there afterward and replay it piece by piece, realizing just how helpless you were in that moment. I had read about REM and sleep paralysis before, so that idea did come to mind. I knew there were experiences people had where they woke up and could not move. I knew some people reported seeing things during those moments. So I did not ignore that possibility. But even then, I was not fully convinced, because what made this harder for me to dismiss was the fact that I had been moving right before it happened. I had woken up, turned my head to the left, and looked around the room. I had not felt frozen then. I had moved my head, and from what I remember, I had also been able to move my arms and legs before the shadow appeared. That was why it felt so different to me from the usual descriptions I had heard. It was not like I woke up already unable to move. It felt like I woke up, became aware, looked around, and only then was pinned down. That detail bothered me. I kept coming back to it in my mind because it seemed important. If I had woken up already frozen, maybe I could have accepted it more easily as some kind of sleep state. But because I had moved first, it felt more real. It felt as if something happened after I woke up, not during the transition from sleep to waking. I know memory in those moments can be tricky, and I know fear can make things feel a certain way. But at the time, and even afterward, that was one of the main reasons I had trouble convincing myself it was just a normal sleep-related event. I also checked the shadows in my room. I did that because once the immediate panic settled a little, I wanted to see if there was any chance that what I had seen had been created by something ordinary in the room. Maybe there had been some shadow from the light that looked strange when I turned my head suddenly. Maybe my eyes had adjusted in a weird way. I wanted an explanation, so I looked around carefully. My room was partly lit because there was a light on my radio that cast some light upward. The ceiling was halfway lit up by it. It was not total darkness in there. That mattered to me because it meant I could see the general shape of the room. I was not staring into complete blackness where any shape could be imagined. There was enough light to make out the room and the shadows within it. As I looked around, I tried to recreate what I had seen. I looked at where the shadow had seemed to stand. I checked the angles. I studied how the dim light hit the walls and ceiling. But nothing I saw in the room looked like that shape had looked. Nothing around me explained the arms, or the head leaning in. Nothing created that same image. The room's shadows looked like normal shadows. They did not look like something leaning over me. I remembered one more detail too. While it was happening, I had looked to the side of my bed, and it had seemed like whatever I was seeing had no lower body. It looked only like an upper torso. That detail felt especially strange. It was as if the darkness ended above the lower part of the bed, or simply did not continue downward in any shape I could see. That made it feel less like an actual person standing there and more like something incomplete. Not transparent exactly, because it was dark, but unfinished. A shape without full form. That only made it harder to explain. What I did not feel, strangely enough, was the sensation of hands physically touching me. That is something I thought about later too. I felt pinned down, absolutely. I could not move, and it looked like there was one arm across each of my shoulders holding me in place. But I did not actually feel hands pressing into me. I did not feel fingers. I did not feel weight on my chest the way some people describe. It was more like my body was simply locked in place while this shape hovered over me in a way that made it seem responsible. Visually, it looked like it was pinning me down, and physically, I could not move, but I did not feel direct touch in the normal sense. That made the whole experience even stranger. It was like the image and the paralysis matched each other perfectly, even without any real physical contact. After it was over, I stayed in bed for a little while. I did not immediately jump up. I think part of me was afraid to move too fast, almost like I was worried something might happen again. I was trying to calm myself down and make sense of what had just happened. I remember sitting there and feeling the room in a completely different way than I had before. A room can feel ordinary your whole life, and then one experience can make it seem unfamiliar. Nothing in the room had changed, but I felt different inside it. I became aware of every sound, every shadow, every detail. The silence after something frightening can feel very loud. I listened for any sign of movement, any sound that might tell me someone or something was actually there. But I heard nothing unusual. The room was still. It was just me and my thoughts, and honestly that was not very comforting. Once your mind starts replaying something like that, the silence gives it more space. Eventually, I worked up the courage to get out of bed and turn the light on. That was not immediate either. I had to force myself to do it. It sounds simple now, but in that moment even the small act of swinging my legs over the side of the bed felt difficult. Fear makes even ordinary movement feel risky. I was half afraid that the second I moved, I would see it again. Or that I would turn the light on and find something standing there. My mind was working against me by then, feeding me possibilities that did not help. But I also knew I could not just stay there forever in the dark thinking about it. By the time I finally got up and turned the light on, it was 6:08 in the morning. I remember looking at the time and noticing it because everything had happened with such force that I wanted to pin it to something concrete. Time is one of the few things you can hold on to after a strange event. Seeing 6:08 a.m. made it feel more real in a way, like this had happened at an actual moment in an actual morning, and not just in some blurry half-dream. I was fully awake then. The light was on. The room looked normal. And yet it did not feel normal to me anymore. I looked around carefully once the light was on. Of course there was nothing there. The space beside the bed was empty. The room was exactly as it should have been. The walls, the furniture, the radio, everything was in place. Nothing in the light explained what I had just seen in the dark. If anything, the normal look of the room only made the experience feel more unreal, which was its own kind of unsettling. It is a strange thing to go from seeing something so vividly to standing in the same room seconds later and finding nothing at all. I thought again about the voice. That part bothered me almost as much as the shadow itself because it came first. It felt like the voice had woken me up for a reason, as if it had drawn my attention before the shadow appeared. If the whole thing had been only the paralysis and the figure, maybe I would have been quicker to blame the entire event on sleep. But the voice saying my name was so specific. It was not random noise. It was not a sound I could easily dismiss. It knew my name, or at least it sounded like it did. And because it sounded female, I kept trying to place it. Did it sound like someone I knew? Did it sound familiar at all? The truth is, I could not match it to anyone. It was simply a female voice, clear and short, speaking my name once. That left me with a lot of questions. Why my name? Why only once? Why did it come from the left when the shadow appeared on the right? Why did I wake so suddenly? Why was the shape over me immediately when I looked that way? And why did it vanish the moment I finally managed to break free? I did not have answers then, and I still do not really have answers now. I only have the memory of how it happened and how real it felt in the moment. The more I replayed it, the more specific details returned to me. I remembered how alert I felt when I first opened my eyes. I remembered how natural it felt to turn my head from left to right. I remembered that instant of shock when the shadow came into view. I remembered the frantic effort to move and the awful weakness of the sounds that came out instead of a scream. I remembered squeezing my eyes shut because seeing it was almost worse than feeling trapped by it. And I remembered the immediate release when it was gone, as though some switch had been flipped and my body belonged to me again. The hardest part of an experience like that is not just the moment itself. It is what comes after. After something so strange happens, your mind starts splitting in two directions. One part of you wants the simplest explanation possible. It wants to say there is a reason for this, something normal, something studied, something that happens to people sometimes. The other part of you cannot let go of how vivid and personal it felt. It cannot forget that this was not an abstract idea or a story you heard from someone else. It happened to you, in your bed, in your room, in the early morning when you heard your own name said out loud. Those two parts of the mind do not always agree with each other. I found myself caught between them. On one side, I had the explanation I knew people would probably give: sleep paralysis. A waking dream. A strange overlap between dreaming and being awake. I knew that was possible. I was not ignoring it, and I am still not ignoring it. But on the other side was the feeling that I had been awake enough to move before it started, awake enough to look around clearly, awake enough to inspect the room afterward and see that nothing in it matched what I had seen. That side of the experience was harder to talk myself out of. And then there was the fear that came after the fact. At first, as I said, I was not immediately scared once it ended. But once I had time to think, the fear settled in deeper. Not just fear of what had happened, but fear of it happening again. That is another thing about experiences like this. They change the way you feel about going back to sleep. A bed is supposed to be a safe place. Sleep is supposed to be a break from the world. But after something like that, even lying down can make you tense. You start paying attention to shadows, to silence, to the way the room feels before dawn. You start wondering whether the same thing will happen the next time you drift off. That kind of fear lingers longer than the actual event. I remember feeling vulnerable in a way I had not before. It is one thing to be scared by a noise in the house or something outside your window. At least then you can get up, look around, lock a door, turn on a light, do something. But when the frightening thing happens while you are trapped in your own body, in your own bed, it touches a different kind of fear. It makes you feel as if even your own body cannot be relied on to protect you. That was one of the worst parts for me. I could not move. I could not call out. I was present for the whole thing, but I had no control. That feeling stayed with me long after the 10 seconds were over. I also kept thinking about how close it had been to my face. That rapid movement of the head, toward my face and away again, felt almost aggressive even though the shape had no visible expression. It is hard to explain why that part was so disturbing. Maybe it was because it felt intentional, like it was focused on me. Maybe it was because anything moving that close to your face while you are unable to pull away is deeply unsettling. Or maybe it was because it made the whole event feel personal. Not just a shadow in the room. Not just a dark shape at the side of the bed. It was over me, focused on me, invading my space. That made it hard to dismiss emotionally, even if my rational mind tried. I do not know whether other people would understand that unless they had gone through something similar. It is easy to talk calmly about these things afterward. It is easy to say maybe it was this or maybe it was that. But during the experience, none of that mattered. During those seconds, it felt real. It felt immediate. It felt like something was there. Even now, if I picture it, I can still see the angle of it beside my bed. I can still remember turning my head right, and seeing it there, as if it had been waiting just outside my line of sight. I can still remember the upper body shape without any lower half visible. I can still remember the darkness of it against the dim room. It is not the kind of memory that fades easily, because it was tied to such strong fear. At the same time, I do not want to claim more than I know. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I know I heard my name. I know I could not move. I know I could barely make sound. And I know it ended suddenly and completely. Beyond that, I cannot say with certainty what it was. I can only say that it happened, and it happened in a way that felt very real to me. Whether it was something connected to sleep or something I cannot explain, I do not know. That uncertainty is part of what makes it stay with me. If I had a solid answer, I could file it away in my mind and move on. But because I do not, the experience still sits there unresolved. When I think about that morning now, one detail that always comes back to me is the time. 6:08 a.m. There is something unsettling about how ordinary that number is compared to how strange the experience was. It was not midnight. It was not the middle of some stormy night. It was early morning, almost day, the kind of time when most people assume the night's fears are ending. That somehow made it feel stranger. It happened in that quiet space when darkness is starting to fade but the world is not fully awake yet. And maybe that is why it stays in my mind the way it does. It happened on the edge of things. On the edge of sleep and waking. on the edge of dream and reality, on the edge of movement and paralysis, on the edge of seeing something and not being able to explain what you saw. I had never had anything like that happen before, and that was what made it so shocking. If I had experienced it many times, maybe I would have had some framework for it. Maybe I would have recognized it immediately as one thing or another. But because it was the first time, it felt like being dropped into something I did not understand with no warning at all. That is why the memory remained so clear. It was brief, but it was powerful. It was confusing, but it was vivid. It was terrifying, but it was over before I could do anything except endure it. And afterward, all I could do was sit there in the quiet of my room, staring at the time on the clock, trying to decide whether what had just happened belonged to the world of sleep or the world of waking. Even now, I still cannot say for sure. I only know that a female voice said my name. I woke and looked around. I turned my head to the right and saw a shadow-like figure over me. I could not move or scream, and when it was over, it was 6:08 in the morning and I was left wide awake with more questions than answers. That is exactly how it happened, and that is why I have never forgotten it. When I was a child, my family lived in a rented house just outside Richmond, Virginia. It was near a large elementary school off Hull Street, and even though I was very young at the time, there are certain things about that place I still remember clearly. The house itself was small, just a simple one-story home with 2 bedrooms. It did not stand out in any special way. It looked like the kind of house people rented for a while and then moved on from without thinking much about it. At least that is how it seemed on the outside. But what happened there stayed with my family for years, and the more time passed, the stranger the whole thing became. I do not remember the exact moment it started. It was not as if one day something dramatic happened and everyone suddenly noticed it. It was more subtle than that. It began with my younger brother talking about someone named Jimmy. At first, nobody thought much of it. Children make up imaginary friends all the time, especially when they are very young, and my brother was only around 3 years old then. He did not really have any other children his age to play with, so if he spoke about a friend nobody could see, it was easy to assume he had invented one for company. To the adults around him, that explanation probably seemed simple and harmless. My brother and I shared a bedroom in that house. I was a little older than he was, old enough to notice things but still too young to fully understand them. Sometimes I would walk into our room and find my brother already in there, talking as if someone else was with him. He would not act embarrassed or guilty the way some children do when they know they are pretending. He would act as though he had really been interrupted. More than once, when I came into the room, he would tell me that Jimmy was hiding because he did not like to be seen. He would say it so naturally, so seriously, that even as a child I knew my brother was not joking. He honestly believed Jimmy was there. At the time, I did not know what to think. I was young too, and young children accept strange things more easily than adults do. If my brother said he had a friend named Jimmy who hid when I entered the room, I probably thought it was odd, but not impossible. In a child's world, imagination and reality often sit side by side. I do not think any of us were scared then. It was just another one of those strange little things children say. Around the same time we lived in that house, my family got a German Shepherd puppy. We named her Lady. She came from the towing service where my father worked. Her parents were guard dogs there, and from what I was always told, they were strong, dependable animals. Lady was still only a puppy when we got her, but she already had that watchful nature some dogs seem born with. At the same time, she was gentle, especially with my brother. He absolutely loved that dog. He played with her all the time, and she seemed to stay close to him whenever she could. They had that easy bond little kids sometimes form with dogs, where the dog becomes protector, playmate, and companion all at once. Looking back now, Lady feels like an important part of the story, even though at the time she was just our dog. Sometimes animals seem to notice things before people do. I cannot say that for certain, of course, but when I think about what happened in that house, I always come back to Lady and the way she acted. There was one summer afternoon that became the center of the whole story. though none of us knew it then. I was about 5 years old, and my brother was about 3. At that age, afternoons can stretch out in memory strangely. I remember the feeling of the day more than every exact detail. It was warm, bright, and ordinary in the way summer afternoons often are when you are small. The kind of day where parents are busy, children drift in and out of the yard, and time moves without much structure. At some point that afternoon, my brother and Lady left the yard and went walking. I do not know how long they were gone. When you are a child, small amounts of time can feel larger or smaller than they really are, so I cannot say whether they were gone for 10 minutes or 30. All I know is that eventually my brother came back, and he was upset. Not a little upset, not the kind of whining children do when something minor goes wrong. He was genuinely bothered and near tears. One of the first things everyone noticed was that his pants were ripped. My parents were surprised by that because Lady had a very gentle nature, even as a puppy. She was not rough with us, and nobody expected her to harm my brother. So when he came back saying Lady had ripped his pants, it naturally confused them. They asked him what he had been doing and where he had been when it happened. Their questions were probably practical at first. Had he fallen? Had the dog been playing too rough? Had he wandered somewhere he should not have gone? That was when my brother gave the explanation none of them expected. He said that he and Jimmy had been going to see the water. There was a small pond at the end of our street, surrounded by trees. To a child, especially a very young child, it must have looked mysterious and inviting. It was the kind of place kids are naturally drawn to. Hidden a little, not fully visible from the road, tucked behind trees like it held its own little world. But my brother was too young to be going there alone, and our parents knew that. So when he said he and Jimmy had been heading there, it immediately became serious. But that was not the strangest part. My brother explained that every time they tried to go beyond the trees, Lady would bark and growl at Jimmy. Not at my brother. At Jimmy. She barked so much and growled so hard that my brother finally decided to take her home. Then, according to him, Lady grabbed him by the back of his pants, by his breeches, and dragged him home. Even now, that image stays in my mind. A small German Shepherd puppy, normally gentle and loving, becoming determined enough to physically drag a child away from the woods near that pond. To my parents, it likely sounded like a child's dramatic version of events. They reminded him that he was not allowed to go down to the pond alone, and told him that Lady was doing her job by bringing him back. That much made sense. The dog had recognized danger, or at least recognized that he had gone too far, and had brought him home. That was probably how they tried to understand it. But my brother would not let go of one point. He insisted he had not been alone. He said he had been with Jimmy. That was when my mother, trying to answer him in a practical way, made a simple comment. She said something like Jimmy's mother probably wanted him to come home too. It was the kind of thing adults say to redirect children, especially when they think the child is talking about someone imaginary. But my brother answered in a way none of them expected. He said Jimmy was home. Then he said something even stranger. He said we lived in Jimmy's house. He said Jimmy had lived there first. And then he said Jimmy's mother had gone away. Those words must have landed strangely in that small house, even if nobody wanted to admit it. A 3-year-old child is not supposed to say things like that with any real meaning behind them. He was too young to understand property, history, or former tenants. He should not have had any reason to speak as though someone else had once lived in our home. Yet that is exactly what he did. At the time, though, my parents likely did what most parents would do. They probably treated it as odd but not deeply important. Children say all sorts of things. If you stopped and built a mystery around every strange sentence a 3-year-old spoke, you would never get through the day. So life went on. The moment passed, at least on the surface. But the story of Jimmy stayed somewhere in the family memory, even if it faded for a while. I do not remember exactly when we moved out of that house. I only know that after we left, Jimmy was never mentioned again. It was as though he stayed behind with that place. My brother stopped talking about him. There were no stories about Jimmy in the next house, no comments about him showing up anywhere else, no continued imaginary friendship. Once we were gone from that little rented house near the school and the pond, Jimmy disappeared from our lives completely. For a long time, that was the end of it. Years passed. Childhood moved on. The old house became just another place we had once lived. If the story of Jimmy came up at all, it was probably more like a family oddity than anything else. The kind of thing parents mention once in a while when talking about things their children said when they were young. Strange, maybe? Memorable, certainly. But still the kind of story that could be explained away if you wanted it to be. Then, when I was in high school, something happened that changed all of that. One day I was riding around with my boyfriend. We happened to pass the old elementary school near where we had once lived. Seeing it brought back something in me, some old memory of the neighborhood, and I suddenly wanted to find the house again. Childhood places can pull at you that way. Even if you have not seen them in years, part of you wants to know whether they are still there, whether they look the same, whether the world of your early memory was real in the way you remember it. So we drove down the old street. I saw the house we had once lived in, and even after all those years, there was something strange about seeing it again. Houses always seem smaller when you return to them after childhood. The places that once felt like whole worlds shrink into ordinary buildings. But even though it looked small and plain, I felt drawn to it. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know whether anyone in the neighborhood remembered anything about it. There was a woman walking a dog in front of the house, so I stopped and talked to her. I asked how long she had lived in the neighborhood and whether she knew anything about the house. I do not know exactly what I expected to hear. Maybe I thought she might mention who had owned it before, or how long it had been there, or some normal piece of history. Instead, she told me there was a lady who lived at the end of the street who might know more. So I went to see that lady. Sometimes people tell stories in a way that makes it clear the moment stayed with them. This was one of those times. When I asked her about the house, she changed. She seemed to pale. She looked unsettled, almost as if a chill had gone through her. It was a small reaction, but strong enough that I noticed it right away. That alone told me there was something connected to the house that had not been forgotten in the neighborhood. I told her that I had lived there in the early 1970s. I wanted her to understand I was not asking out of idle curiosity. I had really lived in that house. Whatever history it had, my family had unknowingly stepped into it. For a moment, she seemed hesitant. It was almost as if she did not want to tell me. But then she finally said the one thing that turned an old family story into something much harder to dismiss. She told me that a mother and her little boy had once lived in that house. Then she said that one summer, the little boy drowned in the pond at the end of the street. Even without the next part, that would have been enough to shake me. Just hearing that there had once been a little boy living in our house, and that he had drowned in the same pond my brother and his unseen friend had wanted to visit, was deeply unsettling. Suddenly the strange things my brother had said years earlier no longer seemed random. They started to fit together in a way that felt impossible to ignore. But then I asked the question that made everything worse. I asked if the little boy's name had been Jimmy. The woman looked at me and asked, "How did you know that?" That moment must have felt like the ground dropping out from under me. Because how did I know that? I knew it because years earlier, when my brother was only 3 years old, he had spent time talking about a best friend named Jimmy who hid in our shared bedroom, who did not like to be seen, who said our house had once been his, and who wanted to go down to the pond. A pond where, according to the woman, a little boy named Jimmy had drowned. There are moments when coincidence stops feeling like coincidence, even if you still try to force yourself to think rationally. This was one of those moments. Everything my brother had said years earlier suddenly carried a weight it had not had before. Or maybe it had always carried that weight, and we had simply not known enough to recognize it. The strangest part was that my brother himself had not remembered Jimmy for years. Like I said, once we moved, Jimmy was never mentioned again. It was as though the memory had faded with the house. But when my mother retold the old story later, something in him came back. He suddenly remembered Jimmy. Not in a vague way either. He remembered him clearly enough to insist that Jimmy had been real. And then he said one final thing that made the whole story even more unsettling. He said he could not understand why Jimmy lived in our closet. That detail chills me more than almost anything else in the story. As children, my brother and I shared that bedroom. If Jimmy hid whenever I entered the room, and if my brother later remembered him as someone who lived in the closet, then that meant the place my brother believed Jimmy stayed was not just somewhere in the room. It was in that small enclosed space where children hang clothes, store toys, and fear the dark after bedtime. To a child, a closet is already a mysterious place. It holds shadows even in the daytime. But to hear that my brother believed his real friend lived there makes the whole memory feel more vivid and more disturbing. I often think about my brother at 3 years old, standing in that little bedroom, talking to someone nobody else could see. I think about him saying Jimmy did not like to be seen. That line takes on a completely different meaning now. At the time, it sounded like a child protecting the rules of an imaginary game. But after learning what we did, it sounds more like he was describing exactly how Jimmy existed in that house. Present but hidden. There, but not visible to everyone. I also think about Lady. The more I revisit the story, the more important the dog becomes. My brother adored her, and she was gentle with him. Yet when he and Jimmy tried to go down toward the pond, Lady barked and growled at Jimmy so fiercely that she would not let them continue. Then she physically dragged my brother home by his pants. That action looks very different in hindsight. It no longer feels like a puppy simply being playful or rough. It feels protective, almost urgent, as if she recognized danger where my brother did not. And what exactly was she reacting to? Was she growling at empty air because my brother was trying to go too far from home? Was she reacting to his excitement and fear? Or was she reacting to something, or someone, that none of the adults could see? I cannot answer that. But the image of her standing between my brother and the trees near the pond feels powerful now. If animals can sense things beyond us, maybe Lady knew that whatever was leading him toward the water was not something she wanted him following. That possibility has stayed with me for years. It is difficult not to wonder whether, in some strange way, she saved him. Because imagine if she had not brought him home. Imagine if she had simply wandered along with him all the way to that pond. He was only 3 years old. Even without anything supernatural involved, a pond and a toddler are a dangerous mix. But in the shadow of what we later learned, it becomes even harder not to see Lady's behavior as something more than ordinary. It feels like she intervened, as though she refused to let history repeat itself. That thought has haunted me more than the idea of a ghost ever did. The story of Jimmy is not frightening to me because it feels violent. It is frightening because it feels sad. There is something deeply sorrowful about a small boy who drowned one summer, a boy whose mother and life were left behind, a boy who perhaps did not understand he was gone, or perhaps did understand and could not let go of the house he had lived in. When my brother said Jimmy told him that our family lived in his house and that he had lived there first, it sounded possessive on one level, but also heartbreaking. It sounded like the words of a child still attached to the only place he knew as home. Then there was the part about Jimmy's mother. My brother said Jimmy told him his mother had gone away. That line feels unbearably sad now. A small child would explain absence in simple language. If Jimmy's mother remained in the house after his death for a while, grieving and broken, maybe in the child's understanding she had simply gone away when she eventually left. Or perhaps if he was the one who left this world and did not understand it, that was the only way he could describe the separation. Either reading is painful. Either way, it captures loss to a child's eyes. Sometimes the most chilling stories are not the ones about monsters or evil spirits. They are the ones where something lost seems to remain behind because it does not know how to move on. Jimmy, if that is truly who my brother was seeing, does not come across in this story as malicious. He sounds lonely. He sounds like a child who wanted a playmate. A child who found one in my brother because they were close in age and because my brother could somehow see or sense him in a way others could not. That makes the whole thing feel even stranger. Why my brother? Maybe because he was only 3, still young enough to accept another child in the room without questioning it. Maybe because children are often said to be more open to things adults ignore. Maybe because Jimmy, if he was there, recognized another little boy and reached out the only way he could. I do not know. But I have often wondered whether Jimmy had been there all along, waiting for someone who could notice him. There is also the detail of the closet. When my brother remembered Jimmy years later and said he was real but that he did not understand why Jimmy lived in the closet, that remark made me imagine how all of this might have looked from a child's point of view. Maybe Jimmy was not literally inside the closet in the sense an adult would mean. Maybe that was simply where my brother saw him hiding when I entered the room. Maybe the closet was the shadowed place where Jimmy retreated. Maybe it was the boundary between being seen and not seen. To a child, that would be enough to say someone lived there. Still, that image stays with me. A little boy's ghost, if that is what he was, hiding in the closet of the bedroom 2 living children shared. Waiting there, playing there, refusing to show himself to me, but talking freely with my brother. When I think about the old house itself, I wonder what it carried inside those walls. It was just a rented house to us. We moved in without knowing its history. We lived our life in it. My mother cooked meals there. My father went to work from there. My brother and I slept in that shared bedroom, and none of us knew that years earlier another family had lived under the same roof with a little boy named Jimmy. We did not know tragedy had touched that place. We did not know the pond at the end of the street had taken a child from that house. Maybe houses hold on to things. Not in a dramatic movie way, where doors slam and objects fly across rooms, but in a quieter, sadder way. Maybe memory settles into a place. Maybe grief does too. Maybe a child's laughter, loneliness, or unfinished attachment can linger in ways we do not understand. I cannot prove any of that. But if my brother's stories were only imagination, then it is a powerful coincidence that the name, the house, and the pond all matched a real tragedy from before our time. And then there is the question that always comes with stories like this. Could my brother somehow have heard the name Jimmy somewhere without anyone realizing it? Could he have picked up part of the story from an adult conversation, even in pieces, and turned it into a childhood fantasy? That is the kind of explanation people naturally reach for, and I understand why. But if that happened, nobody in the family ever knew it. As far as we understood, there had been no reason for him to know that name or that history. He was only 3. He was not old enough to go asking neighbors questions or digging into the past. And even if he had somehow heard the name, that still does not easily explain why he said Jimmy had lived in our house first, or why Jimmy wanted to go to the pond. The pond remains one of the most powerful parts of the story for me. Children are often drawn to water without understanding the danger. It is beautiful, shiny, mysterious. But water can also carry its own kind of silence and sorrow. The fact that Jimmy died in that pond and later, according to my brother, wanted to return there with him feels deeply unsettling. Was he simply trying to go somewhere familiar? Was he replaying the path of his own last day without understanding it? Or was he trying to take my brother with him? That last thought is the darkest one, and I do not know whether I believe it. The story does not clearly point to malice. But the fact that Lady would not allow them past the trees makes it impossible not to wonder. Maybe Lady sensed danger that had nothing to do with ghosts at all. Maybe she simply recognized the pond as dangerous for a small child. That is entirely possible. Dogs are observant, and she may have understood, in the instinctive way dogs sometimes do, that my brother should not go there. But even if that is the explanation, it does not make the moment less powerful. A child, an unseen friend named Jimmy, a path through the trees toward the pond where a real Jimmy had once drowned, and a dog refusing to let him continue. Even the most practical version of that scene feels eerie. I imagine my brother at that age, walking with complete trust, believing he was with a real friend. I imagine him speaking casually to someone beside him. I imagine Lady stopping, barking into space, growling, refusing to move forward. I imagine my brother getting frustrated, not understanding why the dog was behaving that way. Then I imagine Lady grabbing his pants and dragging him back, determined to bring him home. It is a vivid scene, and one that feels more haunting the older I get. What stays with me most is that Jimmy was never described as frightening. My brother did not say he was a monster. He did not say Jimmy hurt him. He did not talk about evil. He talked about a best friend. A playmate. Someone real to him. That is what makes the later discovery so emotionally complicated. This is not a story of a child being terrorized by something in the house. It is a story of a lonely child, perhaps living and perhaps dead, finding another child to play with. That makes it sadder, stranger, and in some ways more believable. If my brother had invented a terrifying ghost, that would sound like a child's imagination running wild. But inventing a best friend who has a normal little boy name, who hides because he does not like to be seen, and who says the house used to be his feels different. It feels like memory rather than invention. Not my memory, of course. Someone else's. Years later, after hearing the woman at the end of the street confirm Jimmy's name, I must have replayed my childhood again and again in my mind. I wondered what else I might have missed. I wondered whether Jimmy had ever been in the room when I was there but hidden from me. I wondered whether there had been moments when my brother laughed or talked and I assumed he was alone, when in his mind he truly was not. I wondered whether my parents, had they known the story back then, would have reacted differently. Would they have moved sooner? Would they have forbidden my brother from speaking about Jimmy? Or would they have listened more carefully and asked questions nobody thought to ask then? There is also the question of why Jimmy stopped being mentioned after we moved. If he was imaginary, then maybe my brother simply outgrew him, or left that phase behind. But if he was something else, perhaps he belonged to that house and that patch of land. Perhaps he could not leave it. Perhaps his presence was tied to the place where he had lived and died. That possibility fits the story in a way that is hard to ignore. Jimmy did not follow us. He did not show up in another bedroom, another closet, another yard. He stayed there, in the rented house by the school and the pond. That detail matters to me. It suggests a boundary. A connection to place rather than to person. And that, more than anything, is what makes this story feel less like imagination and more like a haunting memory of something real, even if it was not real in the ordinary sense. As an adult, I have tried to look at it from every angle. I have asked myself whether the woman in the neighborhood might have influenced my memory after the fact. I have asked whether family stories grow stronger over time, shaped by retelling. I have wondered whether my brother's later memory of Jimmy was sharpened by hearing the old story again. All of those are fair questions. Memory is not perfect. Childhood memory especially can be fragile and incomplete. But some parts remain stubborn. The name Jimmy. The house. The pond. The claim that Jimmy had lived there first. The strange comment that his mother had gone away. The dog growling at him and dragging my brother home. And the later confirmation from a neighbor that a little boy named Jimmy had indeed lived in that house and drowned in that pond. Even if some details blurred over time, that core remains difficult to explain away. Sometimes I think about Jimmy himself, separate from the fear and mystery. If he was there in any form, what must that have been like? To remain in the place where you once lived, to still think of it as your home, to play with a little boy who now slept in your room, to want to go back to the pond that ended your life. It is a tragic picture. Not evil. Not angry. Just sad. The sadness of a child caught between memory and place. It also makes me think about children in general and how differently they understand the world. My brother, at 3 years old, did not question Jimmy's presence. He did not see him as impossible. He simply accepted him. Maybe that openness is why children so often appear in stories like this, both as ghosts and as the ones who see ghosts. They move through the world with fewer fixed rules. They are willing to accept what adults would immediately reject. That does not prove anything supernatural, of course, but it may explain why my brother spoke so freely about Jimmy while the rest of us only later realized how strange it was. I cannot know for certain what happened in that house. I cannot say with proof that my brother's best friend was the ghost of a drowned boy. but I can say that all the pieces line up in a way that has stayed with me my whole life. I can say that something about the story feels too exact to dismiss completely. And I can say that the older I get, the less this story feels like a silly childhood tale, and the more it feels like a brush with something we only half understood. I still picture that small rented house outside Richmond, near the elementary school off Hull Street. I picture the two-bedroom layout, my brother and me sharing a room, a closet in the corner where he believed Jimmy hid. I picture Lady as a puppy, loyal and protective, staying close to my brother. I picture the road leading down toward the trees and the pond at the end of the street. Then I picture the story unfolding quietly inside ordinary family life, unnoticed for what it really was until years later. That may be what makes it so haunting. Nothing about it announced itself dramatically at the time. There was no thunderstorm, no dark figure at the end of a hall, no violent event inside the home. It was just a child talking about his friend, a dog acting strangely, a walk toward the pond, a few sentences from a 3-year-old that sounded odd but not impossible. Only later did those things settle into their true shape, and by then there was no way to go back and ask Jimmy who he was or why he stayed. If I could go back now, I think I would listen more closely. I would ask my brother exactly what Jimmy looked like. I would ask what kind of clothes he wore, how old he seemed, whether he ever talked about the pond, whether he seemed sad or happy, whether he always stayed in the room or followed him around the house. I would ask what he meant when he said Jimmy's mother had gone away. I would ask why Jimmy hid from me. I would ask what made him think Jimmy lived in the closet. But of course I cannot ask those things now in the same pure way. Too much time has passed. Too much knowledge came later. Any answers would now be shaped by everything we learned afterward. The innocence of those first moments is gone. All that remains is the story, the memory, and the unanswered questions. And maybe that is why it still lingers. Because it never fully ended. Yes, we moved away. Yes, Jimmy was not mentioned again. Yes, life went on. But the story kept waiting in the background until the day I returned to that neighborhood and a pale-looking woman told me about a mother, a little boy, and a drowning in the pond. In that moment, the past opened again, and suddenly what had once seemed like childhood imagination took on a much darker and sadder meaning. Even now, if someone asked me what part of the story unsettles me most, I am not sure what I would say. It might be the name matching so perfectly. It might be the idea of Jimmy hiding in the closet. It might be Lady growling at empty space. Or it might be the heartbreaking simplicity of my brother saying Jimmy told him. We live in his house. He lived there first. His mother went away. Those are not the words of a horror movie. They are the words of a child repeating what another child told him. And maybe that is exactly why they are so chilling. Because they feel real. Because they feel innocent. Because they sound like something a lonely little boy would say if he did not understand why everything he loved had been taken from him. So when I think back on that house now, I do not just think of fear. I think of loss. I think of unfinished childhood. I think of a small boy named Jimmy who may have drowned one summer and somehow remained tied to the place he called home. I think of my brother, only 3 years old, making a friend no one else could see. I think of a faithful dog who would not let him walk into danger. And I think of how sometimes the strangest stories are not about seeing ghosts yourself, but about realizing years later that someone in your family may have been living beside one without ever knowing it. That is what happened in that house as best as I can tell it. We were just a family renting a small home near a school and a pond. My younger brother had a best friend named Jimmy. He said Jimmy hid because he did not like to be seen. He said Jimmy had lived in the house first. He said Jimmy's mother had gone away. He tried to walk with Jimmy to the pond where a little boy named Jimmy had once drowned. And years later, when I asked an old neighbor about the house, she turned pale and asked me how I knew the drowned little boy's name. No matter how many years pass, that is the part one can never explain away. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. There was a girl I went to school with for many years. We were never best friends, but she was one of those people who stays somewhere in your memory, even when time passes and life moves on. Some people come and go so quietly that you barely remember their names a few years later. Others leave something behind without even trying. Julie was one of those people for me. I went through grade school, middle school, and high school with a lot of the same people, like most of us do. Year after year, you see the same faces in hallways, classrooms, lunchrooms, gymnasiums, and school events. Some people are just familiar faces. Some you know only by name. Some become close friends. And some are never especially close to you, but for reasons you cannot explain, they stay with you anyway. Julie was like that. She was always there, somewhere in the background of my school years, always part of that world, always someone I noticed. She was an ordinary girl in many ways. She was not the prettiest girl in school, not the most popular, not the loudest, not the funniest, not the kind of person everyone gathered around. But she tried. I could always tell that she tried very hard. She wanted to be liked. She wanted to seem strong. She wanted people to think she was confident. She wanted to do well in school. She wanted, I think, what most young girls want at that age, to feel that they belong somewhere, that they matter, that they are seen in a good way. But for some reason, none of those things ever seemed to come together for her. There was always something sad about Julie. It was hard to explain. It was not just in the way she talked, because she did not often say openly sad things. It was not even always in the way she acted, because she tried to carry herself like someone who was fine. It was something deeper than that. It was in her face, in her eyes, in the way she held herself. Even when she smiled, I felt like there was something behind it. A heaviness. A loneliness. A feeling that life was harder for her than she let anyone know. Whenever I spoke to Julie, it was usually in group settings, never really in long private conversations. We were not close enough for that. But even in those smaller moments, I noticed how careful she was whenever the subject turned toward her personal life. If anyone asked about her parents, her siblings, her home life, or anything too personal, she would answer only in the most vague way possible. She would give just enough of a response to avoid seeming rude, and then she would quickly change the subject. She did it so often that after a while it became noticeable. It was as if she had built a wall around that part of herself, and would not let anyone get too close. Even as a teenager, I understood that meant something. Usually when people avoid talking about home that strongly, there is a reason. It does not always mean something terrible, but it usually means home is not a place of comfort. That was always the feeling I got from Julie. Whatever her life was like outside of school, it was not something she wanted to share. And yet, even without details, I got the impression that her family struggled financially and probably in other ways too. It was just there in the little pieces she let slip, in the way she carried herself, in the way she talked around certain subjects instead of through them. Then, in high school, things became even harder for her. Julie developed a severe acne problem. Not the small kind many teenagers deal with and eventually grow out of, but something much more serious. Her face became badly affected, and because teenagers can be unbelievably cruel, this only made her life at school harder. Kids can take the smallest weakness, the smallest difference, and turn it into something merciless. I watched that happen to her. Maybe not always directly in front of me, but enough to know it was happening. Julie was already someone who did not seem fully accepted, and this only gave meaner people one more reason to target or avoid her. What made it worse was that her family did not seem to have many resources. Eventually her parents managed to take her to a doctor, which I know must have taken effort and money they did not have much of. But instead of helping, the medication she was given made the problem look even worse. From what I remember, it darkened her skin to a deep red color, which only made her stand out more in a way no teenage girl wants to. I remember feeling bad for her. There was something unfair in the way life seemed to keep adding one more burden to her, one more thing to make the world harder than it already was. Still, she kept trying. That is one of the things I remember most clearly about Julie. She did not completely give up. She still tried to be part of things. She still tried to talk, to be friendly, to fit in. Maybe that was what made me notice her more than some others. There is something heartbreaking about watching someone keep trying to belong in a place that keeps pushing them to the edges. By my junior year, near the end of the school year, there was the usual tradition of signing annuals. Everyone was writing little messages to one another, promising to keep in touch, making plans for summer, scribbling the kind of happy, casual comments teenagers write when they believe life will keep rolling forward in a familiar way. I asked Julie to sign my annual. She did. Afterward, I said something simple, something easy. I told her that we would have one more year together, so that would be good. I meant senior year. One more year in the same building, seeing each other in the halls, finishing school with the same group of people we had grown up around. But she answered in a way I did not expect. She said she was not coming back for her senior year. I asked why. I was surprised. She was not someone I imagined simply disappearing from school, even though maybe I should not have been surprised at all. She told me she never really fit in there anyway. She said it was not like she was a scholar or anything, so she might as well get a job. She said it in a plain way, almost as if she had already accepted that this was simply how life was going to be for her. No grand dreams. No college plans. No hopeful speeches about the future. Just work. But then she added something that stayed with me for years. She said maybe that would not have to be all her life was going to be. Maybe, she said, she would meet her Prince Charming, and the two of them would have a wonderful life together. It was said half like a dream and half like a defense. Like she knew life had not given her much so far, but she still wanted to believe something beautiful might happen someday. I remember feeling sad hearing that. Not because it was silly, but because it seemed like she needed that hope so badly. It felt like she was reaching for some kind of future where she would finally be loved the way she had not been loved enough before. I told her I was sorry she would not be coming back, and I told her to keep in touch. I even gave her my phone number. That was all I could really offer in that moment. It was small, but I wanted her to know that someone cared whether she disappeared or not. That was the last time I saw Julie for many years. Life went on. As it does. School ended. People moved. People married. People changed cities, jobs, names, and routines. Time stretched out and placed distance between those old school days and the life I was now living. Julie became one of those memories tucked somewhere in the back of my mind, not forgotten exactly, but no longer part of my daily thoughts. Then, about 10 months before I finally learned what had happened to her, something strange began. One morning I woke up thinking about Julie. Not in a passing, casual way. Not the kind of thought where someone from school crosses your mind for a second and then disappears again. No. I woke up with Julie in my mind so clearly it felt unusual right away. I had not been talking about her. I had not seen an old yearbook. Nothing obvious had triggered it. Yet from the moment I opened my eyes that day, I was thinking about her. And after that, it only got stranger. Everywhere I went I thought I saw her. It happened over and over. I would be out somewhere, in a store or on a street, and I would catch sight of a woman I was sure was Julie. More than once, I even stopped and tried to talk to her, only to realize it was a stranger. Other times I would think I had seen Julie just ahead of me in a crowd, but by the time I got closer, the woman was gone. It became unsettling after a while. Not because I thought I was seeing a ghost then, but because it felt so persistent. As if the world was suddenly filled with reminders of her, or with shadows of her. I remember thinking, over and over, that I hoped life had worked out for her. I hoped she had gotten the happiness she talked about that day when she said maybe she would find her Prince Charming. I hoped she had found some peace, some love, some place in life where the sadness I always sensed in her had finally eased. I even mentioned it to my husband. He, of course, tried to explain it in a normal way. He said I must have seen someone on television or somewhere else who reminded me of her, and that was why she had gotten stuck in my thoughts. That made sense in the practical way husbands often try to make sense of things. And maybe under normal circumstances that would have been enough. But it was not enough for me. because the feeling kept growing. About a week after I started thinking about Julie, I began feeling something even stronger. I started feeling her sadness. That is the best way I can describe it. Not just remembering that she had once seemed sad, but feeling sad for her in the present tense. It was not, Julie was sad. It was, Julie is sad. That is the strange part. It felt current, immediate, alive. I kept thinking about her and feeling this deep sorrow attached to her, as if somewhere she was suffering and I was somehow brushing up against that pain without understanding why. I wanted to find her. I did not know what I would even say if I did. I just felt more and more strongly that I needed to. I checked phone listings. I searched online. I tried every normal method I could think of. But I could not find her anywhere. The people I knew who had also known her had long since lost contact with her. Julie had slipped out of everyone's life so completely that it was like trying to find a person who had dissolved into air. And still, the thoughts did not stop. About a week and a half after Julie began taking over my thoughts and even my dreams, and a couple of days after I first felt that overwhelming sadness connected to her, I was sitting on the sofa one evening beside my husband. I was reading. He was watching television. It was an ordinary evening, relaxed and unimportant, the kind of evening that gives no warning that it is about to split your life into before and after. The local news came on. At the very beginning of the news broadcast, they did the usual quick highlights. The most important stories first, the little blurbs meant to catch your attention before the full segments. And somewhere in that opening, I heard Julie's name. It was like a shock through my whole body. I knew I had heard it, but I had not caught the whole sentence. My husband had not been paying enough attention to repeat it clearly. So all I could do was sit there and wait. My heart was already pounding because I knew, somehow, that this was connected to everything I had been feeling. I did not know how. I did not know what exactly I was about to hear. But I knew it had something to do with Julie. We kept watching. About 15 minutes into the newscast, they cut to a live report from a street I knew very well. On the screen was an abandoned furniture store and laundromat, boarded up and empty-looking, the kind of place most people pass without thinking twice. But now it was lit by police lights, red and blue flashing across the scene, yellow crime scene tape, emergency vehicles, cameras, reporters. Everything in the frame told me something terrible had happened. And then they said Julie had been found there. She had been discovered in the basement of that abandoned building by a property management company. The details that followed were horrifying. She had been wrapped up crudely, almost stuffed into old filthy rugs in that basement. She had been half-clothed. She had been beaten. She had been sexually assaulted. And then she had been strangled to death with a piece of telephone cord. The cord, they said, had been tied in a bow around her neck. Even now, writing those words feels hard. At the time, I threw my book down and began to cry. Not just cry in a quiet way, but sob. It hit me with a force I cannot fully describe. My husband tried to comfort me, but the grief felt bigger than anything I knew how to control. It was not only horror at what had happened. It was sorrow. Deep, overwhelming sorrow. It felt as if I was crying not only for myself and not only for the loss of someone I had once known, but somehow for her too. As though all that sadness I had been sensing had finally broken open. I cried until I could not cry anymore. At some point I must have cried myself to sleep, because I do not remember going to bed. The next thing I clearly remember is waking up the following morning and realizing my husband had helped me into bed at some point during the night. From there, everything changed. Julie was no longer just a memory from school. She was no longer a strange feeling I could not explain. She was a murdered woman. A victim. A person whose life had ended in a cruel and humiliating way, after so many years of sadness I had already sensed in her when we were young. It was unbearable to think about. They buried her about 15 days later, after a full autopsy had been completed. It was a county funeral. That detail alone says so much. Most of her family would not come forward. Whether from poverty, distance, broken relationships, shame, or whatever other reasons, most of them were absent. There was no large family gathering, no visible circle of loved ones surrounding her, no evidence that people had rushed in to claim her and grieve her together. I went to the graveside ceremony. Only 2 other people we had gone to school with were there besides me. That fact broke my heart almost as much as the murder itself. To stand there and see how few people had come, how little was left around her in death, how thin the line of mourners was, it was devastating. And once again I cried in a way that felt larger than I could explain. The sadness was so strong I could hardly manage it. It felt almost physical, like a weight pressing down inside me. My husband, trying to make sense of how deeply this was affecting me, suggested I might need to see a doctor. Maybe, he thought, it was some kind of emotional issue, maybe a female thing, maybe stress, maybe hormones. I remember feeling frustrated by that. He meant well, I know he did. He was trying to help and understand. But what I was feeling did not feel like some vague emotional imbalance. It felt connected. It felt real. It felt as though something about Julie was still reaching me. Almost exactly 1 month from the day I first began thinking about Julie, something happened that I will never forget. Later, I confirmed the date with my journal, so I know I am not just shaping the story in hindsight. The timing was real. I woke very early one morning and could not go back to sleep. There was no obvious reason. I just found myself wide awake long before I needed to be. So I got up quietly, went downstairs, poured myself a glass of tea, and turned on the television. It was still early and dim outside. The house was quiet in that way houses are before the day properly begins. Then I heard the wind pick up outside. That was not unusual where we lived. Nebraska can do that. Wind can come on suddenly, strong enough to rattle things, strong enough that if a door is not properly latched, you can lose a screen door entirely. We had lost a few that way before. So when I heard the wind, I got up automatically to make sure the front screen door was secure. I went to the front porch to check. And there, outside my door, stood Julie. I just stared at her. There was no confusion in my mind about who it was. It was Julie. Not Julie as she had looked when life had worn her down. Not Julie broken by sadness or marked by acne or pain. She looked beautiful in a simple, familiar way. She was wearing her favorite jeans. She had on her favorite sweatshirt. Her hair was fixed in her favorite style. She was carrying her favorite pink striped purse. Her skin was clear. There was no acne. More than that, there was no sadness. The heaviness I had always seen in her eyes and in her face was gone. She looked peaceful. That is one of the strongest things I remember. Not ghostly in the frightening sense. Not transparent or monstrous or covered in death. Just peaceful. Calm. Present. She looked at me and she spoke. She said, "Well, it didn't happen the way I wanted, but I found peace and harmony the hard way." I listened, frozen in place. She said she had hurt for a long time, but not anymore. Then she said something that cut straight through me. She said she had not found her Prince Charming. As I had seen on the news, he had killed her and turned it into a joke too, just like many people had thought her life was a joke. Even hearing that from her own mouth, even in whatever form that moment took, broke my heart all over again. But then she said something else. She said she was okay now. She said it was peaceful there. She said no one would ever hurt her again. And then she said, "Let's stop crying and thanks for being there." Those were the words. Simple. Tender. Honest. So much like the girl I remembered, still trying to speak through pain and shame and hope all at once. Except now the pain had lifted. I opened my mouth to answer her. And she was gone. There were no lights. No dramatic noise. No flash. No violent gust of wind. No strange effects like in movies. She was just there, and then she was not. Gone as quietly as she had appeared. I stood there for a long moment, unable to do anything except stare at the place where she had been. And for the first time in all of this, I felt something other than crushing grief. I felt relief. Not because of what had happened to her. Nothing could ever make that okay. But because she had come to tell me that whatever suffering had followed her through life, and whatever horror had ended it, she was no longer trapped in that pain. The sadness I had carried for her so heavily was no longer needed in the same way. She had come, at least as I experienced it, to tell me to let go of the crying. That mattered to me more than I can explain. I know how unbelievable that sounds to some people. I know there are many who would say grief can do strange things. That the mind can create comfort when it needs it. That I was overwhelmed and exhausted, and my heart gave me a vision I needed. I understand all of those explanations. I do. And maybe some people will always believe that is what happened. But I know what I saw. I know the peace on her face. I know the absence of sadness. I know the exactness of her clothes, her hair, her purse. I know her words. And I know the comfort that stayed with me after she was gone. What stays with me most, though, is the difference between the Julie I knew in life and the Julie who stood at my door that morning. The Julie I knew as a girl carried sadness like a shadow. Even when she spoke of hope, like finding her Prince Charming, that hope felt fragile, almost desperate. She wanted love so badly. She wanted a life that would finally be kind to her. She wanted to be chosen, cherished, rescued in some emotional way from all the hurts she had already known. The Julie who stood at my door no longer carried that ache. She had not gotten the life she dreamed of. That much she said herself. It had not happened the way she wanted. In fact, it had ended in one of the cruelest ways imaginable. But despite that, she was no longer sad. No longer broken. No longer carrying humiliation, pain, loneliness, or fear. She was at peace. That was the gift she came to give me, not only reassurance for her, but release for me. I have thought often about why I was the one she came to. We were not best friends. We were not lifelong companions. We were simply two girls who had gone to school together, who had spoken in groups, who had shared a few moments, who had one final conversation where she talked about leaving school and hoping for love. Maybe that was enough. Maybe because I had noticed her sadness when others had ignored it. Maybe because I had cared when she disappeared from school. Maybe because I had come to her funeral when so few others did. Maybe because I had cried for her when her own family would hardly come forward. Maybe because in some quiet way, she knew I had seen her humanity when too many others had treated her like she did not matter. Perhaps that is what she meant when she thanked me for being there. Those words have stayed with me. Thanks for being there. Not thanks for solving anything. Not thanks for saving me. Not thanks for understanding it all. Just thanks for being there. Sometimes that is the only gift one person can give another. Presence. Witness. The refusal to let someone suffer and vanish without being mourned. The image of her at the funeral came back to me often after that experience. The county burial. The tiny group of mourners. The missing family. The quiet shame and neglect that seemed to follow her even in death. It hurt me that she had been so alone in the world, so unsupported, so easy for people to dismiss. And yet when she came to me, she did not carry bitterness the way I might have expected. She did not rage. She did not accuse. She did not ask for revenge. She simply told me she had peace now and wanted the crying to stop. There was something almost holy in that. Something gentle. Something merciful. I also could not stop thinking about what she said regarding the man who killed her. She called him her Prince Charming in a bitter, heartbreaking way. She had dreamed as a teenage girl that maybe one day a man would come into her life and help build a wonderful future with her. Instead, the man who should have loved her destroyed her, mocked her, and made her death into some kind of sick joke. That line still cuts me deeply. It says so much about the cruelty she endured and the way hope can be twisted into something terrible. But even that was not the final word. The final word was peace. That is what she came to say. Not revenge. Not horror. Not unfinished terror. Peace. And because of that, what could have remained only a terrible tragedy became something else too, something deeply sad, yes, but also strangely beautiful in the end. Not beautiful because of the crime. Never that. But beautiful because somehow, despite all of it, Julie was not lost in pain forever. I treasure that memory because it healed something in me. Before that morning, my grief over Julie felt out of control. It felt borrowed and endless. It felt like I had become connected to a sorrow I could not carry properly. After seeing her, that changed. I still mourned her. I still thought of her. I still felt anger at what had been done to her and sadness at the life she should have had. But the sharp, wild crying stopped. The helpless feeling eased. It was as if she had come exactly to do that, to untie the knot of grief that had wrapped itself around me since the news story. I do not expect everyone to believe this story exactly as I tell it. I know how it sounds. I know what the world says about things like this. But there are moments in life that do not fit neatly into common explanations, and this was one of them. I had thought of Julie for weeks before her body was found. I had felt her sadness before I knew what had happened. I had searched for her without knowing why. Then I learned of her murder. Then I mourned her deeply. Then, 1 month after the first strange thoughts began, she stood at my door and told me she was finally okay. That is the truth as I lived it. When I think back now on school days, I no longer see only the sad girl with troubled eyes and red skin from failed medication. I do not see only the lonely girl trying so hard to be liked. I still remember her that way, yes, because that was part of her life. But I also remember the last image of her. Clear skin. Favorite clothes. Favorite purse. Peaceful face. No sadness. No fear. No shame. No pain. That is how I choose to hold her now. Not as a victim wrapped in rugs in a filthy basement. Not as a forgotten woman at a county funeral. Not even only as the teenage girl dreaming of Prince Charming because real life had given her so little. I remember her as the woman who came back long enough to tell me she was free. And in that freedom, there was dignity again. There was wholeness again. There was peace. There are certain experiences in life you cannot prove to anyone else, but you know they happened. They sit inside you with a certainty that has nothing to do with evidence, and everything to do with truth. This is one of those experiences for me. I do not need anyone else to confirm it. I do not need anyone else to explain it. It gave me what it needed to give me. It gave Julie back her voice, one final time. And it gave me permission to stop crying. Even now, I sometimes think about that girl signing my annual all those years ago. I think about the sadness in her eyes. I think about her saying maybe she would find her Prince Charming and have a wonderful life. I think about how little either of us knew then. How impossible it would have been to imagine where life would take her. How helpless we all are sometimes, standing beside one another in youth, never knowing the private pain each person carries or the future waiting for them. Maybe that is one reason her story stayed with me so powerfully. Because she was never really seen the way she should have been. She moved through school carrying sorrow, trying to be liked, trying to seem strong, trying to imagine a better future, while most people probably looked past her. But I noticed her. Not enough to save her, no. Not enough to change her life. But enough to remember her. Enough to care. Enough that when she needed someone to bear witness to her pain and then to her peace, maybe I was one of the few left who would truly listen. That matters to me. We live in a world where too many people pass through life unseen, especially those who are poor, awkward, lonely, or burdened by pain other people do not want to look at. Julie was one of those people. She did not move through life surrounded by admiration or protection. She was easy for others to overlook. And then, in death, even more people failed her. But at the end, she was not entirely alone. I was there. A few others were there. And somehow, in one final moment, she came to let me know that she knew it. That is why I will always treasure this memory. Not because it was strange. Not because it was ghostly. But because it was full of grace. Julie had suffered enough in life. She had suffered horribly in death. And yet when she came to me, she came not with fear, but with peace. That is the part of her I carry now. And I always will. When I was in junior high, my dad had a job that kept him away from home most of the month. His company had him gone about 3 weeks out of every month, which meant he was home only a little compared to how much he was traveling. Back then, as a teenager, I thought it was pretty great in some ways. When you are young, having one parent gone that often can feel like having a little more freedom. It meant my dad was not always there watching everything I did, asking where I was going, or checking up on me every minute. At that age, that felt exciting to me. But of course, for him it was exhausting. Living out of a suitcase, working long hours, and spending most of your time away from your family gets old fast, no matter how good you are at handling it. His company was based out of Nebraska, but they also had another location in Arkansas, in a small town called Marianna. It was about 45 minutes from West Memphis, and that was where my dad and 2 other engineers had to spend most of their time. Since they were there so often, the company started looking for a cheaper and more practical option than paying for hotel rooms over and over again. At first, they had stayed at the local Holiday Inn, but after a while the company realized they were spending a huge amount of money just keeping the men there month after month. So they made a decision that probably sounded smart at the time. Instead of continuing to pay hotel rates, they decided to buy a house in town for the engineers to stay in. At first, this seemed like a really good idea. My dad was the one staying there most of the time, probably 90% of the time, and at any point there might be 3 or 4 men using the house. So they needed something with space, something comfortable enough that it could feel almost like a second home while they were working away from their real homes. My dad helped find the place, and it ended up being a huge old house on one of the main streets in Marianna. It was the kind of house people sometimes call a manor house, though I do not know what the locals called it. It had that grand old look to it, the kind of place that clearly came from another time. It had been built sometime in the late 1800s, and just from the way it was described and the way I later saw it, it had the feel of a once important family home. One of the things that made the deal even better, at least in the company's eyes, was that the house came furnished. The woman who had owned it had died, and she had no surviving relatives. Because of that, the furniture had remained in the house. So from the company's point of view, they were getting this massive old 5-bedroom house, already furnished, for a surprisingly cheap price. For men who had gotten used to hotel beds, small rooms, and bland furniture, it probably sounded perfect. They were getting space, history, comfort, and convenience all in one. And then there was the elevator. That was one of the details that fascinated all of us the most when we first heard about the place. There was an actual elevator built inside the house. It turned out the original owner had a daughter who had polio, and instead of carrying her up and down the 3 flights of stairs all the time, the family had installed the elevator. That detail gave the place even more personality. It was not just an old house. It was a house that had adapted itself around the lives of the people who lived there. At first, we all thought that was really cool. As kids, the idea of an elevator inside a private home sounded amazing, almost like something from a movie. For the first couple of months, everything seemed to go really well. The house was close to work, so the commute was easy. The men had enough space that nobody felt cramped. It was comfortable, private, and much more home-like than a hotel. The place became a sort of second home for them. They got used to the rooms, the old furniture, the creaks and noises that naturally come with a very old house. I imagine that at first, whatever little odd things they noticed were easy to shrug off. Old houses always make noises. Old wiring acts up. Old plumbing knocks and groans. Nothing about that would seem especially strange in a place built in the 1800s. But after about 2 months, things started happening that were harder to explain. The first thing was the elevator. My dad and the others began waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of it going up and down. That was not a one-time thing. It happened again and again. They would be asleep, and in the middle of the night they would hear the elevator moving. My dad would get up to check it, probably half irritated and half tired, and every time he looked, everything seemed fine. There was no obvious problem. Nothing looked broken. Nothing looked out of place. So at first he tried to explain it away. He figured maybe it was old wiring, or some electrical issue, or some old mechanical problem that made it sound like it was running when it really was not. Then he would go back to bed. But the problem kept happening. Sometimes it would happen 2 or 3 times in one night. Just imagine that for a moment. You are staying in a huge old house in a small town, already away from your family, and in the middle of the night you keep hearing the elevator moving by itself. At first, you can rationalize it. You can say it is just bad wiring. You can tell yourself old systems act up. But once it starts repeating itself, especially late at night when the whole house is quiet, it becomes harder and harder to ignore. The men were not the only ones who noticed strange things. There was also a caretaker who came by a few times a week. She cleaned the house and kept an eye on it when nobody was staying there. She knew the house well, probably better than the company men did, simply because she moved through it in the daylight and paid attention to the practical details of keeping it in order. Before long, she started complaining about odd things too. Her cleaning supplies would disappear. That might not sound like much at first, but it was happening enough for her to mention it seriously. She would put something somewhere, come back later, and it would be gone. Sometimes she said she felt like someone was in the house with her, even when she knew she was alone. That feeling, the sense that another presence is nearby when nobody should be there, is one of those things people often describe but cannot prove. And because it cannot be proven, many people ignore it. But when those feelings start piling up beside other unexplained things, they become harder to dismiss. One story she told really stood out. She had a garden in the backyard and used gardening gloves regularly. One day those gloves disappeared on her. She could not find them anywhere. Eventually she gave up and bought a new pair. But when she came back, her original gloves were sitting on the kitchen table. That kind of thing is difficult to explain in a normal way. If she had simply misplaced them, why were they suddenly out in plain sight in a different part of the house? Why the kitchen table? Why not somewhere obvious she might have left them? Of course, people misremember things all the time. But when something that keeps disappearing turns back up in a place that almost feels intentional, it starts to seem more personal. Less like simple forgetfulness and more like something, or someone, is moving things around. Still, for a while, everyone tried to laugh it off. That probably changed the night my dad made the panicked phone call to my mother. I still remember that story because it was one of the first times it felt like the strange things in the house were not just odd or amusing. This time, they were genuinely frightened. One night, my dad and a couple of the other guys had driven into Memphis for dinner. They had gone to Beale Street, had ribs and a couple of beers, and then headed back to Mariana and to the house. It sounded like a pretty normal evening. They had probably relaxed for a little while, eaten well, and returned home tired and ready for bed. Then, around 2 in the morning, my dad and Larry, whose room was right next to my dad's, woke up to the sound of someone running up and down the hall. Not walking. Running. It sounded to them like someone was going back and forth in the hallway, almost like they were heading to the bathroom at the end of the hall. At that point, they were convinced someone had gotten into the house. This was no longer just an elevator making noise or supplies going missing. This sounded like an actual intruder moving through the hallway in the middle of the night. My dad kept a handgun in the nightstand, so he grabbed it. He and Larry got up, probably trying to stay quiet while also preparing for whatever they were about to find. In their minds, they were sure they would catch somebody hiding in the bathroom or somewhere nearby. They must have been tense, probably expecting a dangerous or at least very serious confrontation. They opened the bathroom door, and inside, they found muddy footprints. The footprints led into the bathtub. And then they stopped. That was it. No person. No open window. No sign of forced entry. Just muddy footprints going into the bathtub and ending there. That would be unsettling in any house. But in a huge, old house already known for an elevator that moved by itself and objects that disappeared and returned, it must have been deeply disturbing. At that point, they were not just confused. They were freaked out. They checked everything. They checked the windows. They checked the doors. Nothing had been disturbed. No one had broken in. No one had climbed out. There was simply no normal explanation sitting there for them. After that, they started referring to it as the ghosts of the house. I do not think they all necessarily believed with full certainty that the place was haunted, but it became the easiest way to talk about it. People often laugh when they are uncomfortable, and I think that is what happened. They joked about the old ghosts of the house. They rolled their eyes. They told stories about it. But underneath the humor, there was real unease. Sometimes they did not feel comfortable staying there alone. That says a lot. It is one thing to joke about ghosts in daylight, or in a group. It is another thing to lie in a huge old bedroom by yourself at night after hearing an elevator move and footsteps run down the hall. Then came the summer when the company decided to fly all the families into Memphis for a kind of company picnic. That sounds nice on its own. A company event, some family time, a chance for everyone to see where the men had been staying so much of the year. They put the families up in Forest City, which was about halfway between Marianna and Memphis, and then the second night everyone stayed in Memphis. Apparently all the men had teenage daughters, and for one reason or another they did not think we girls would be comfortable actually sleeping in that old house. Looking back, that now seems pretty telling. They may not have admitted how strange the place had become, but clearly they were not eager to leave their families there overnight. Still, we did spend the first afternoon at the house. And of course, we were teenagers. Teenage girls snoop. That is just the truth. Put a bunch of teenage girls into a giant old mansion-like house full of old furniture, strange stories, and creepy details, and of course they are going to explore everything. We wanted to see it all. The house itself made a strong impression on me. It felt large and old in a way that was hard to ignore. The stairs creaked. The rooms were full of old furniture that made the place feel preserved rather than lived in. You could sense the age of the house in every part of it. It did not feel modern in any way. It felt like a place still half attached to another time. One of the eeriest things in the house was a huge portrait of the owner. When you went up the first set of stairs and reached the landing for the second floor, there it was. A large portrait of the woman who had once owned the house. What made it so unsettling was not that it was centuries old or badly damaged. In fact, I remember thinking it had probably been done in the 1960s or early 1970s, so it was not even ancient. But the way she was painted made it seem like she was looking straight at you no matter where you stood. No matter how you moved, it felt like her eyes followed you. That kind of portrait is unnerving even in a normal house. In a huge old place where the men had already experienced strange things, it was worse. It made the whole place feel watched. Still, being teenage girls, we kept exploring. You would go up the next set of stairs, and there was a door that led to another staircase going up to the attic. That was exactly the kind of place we wanted to see. An old attic in an old mansion? Of course we were curious. One of the other girls and I decided to go take a look. We opened the door that led to the attic steps. And the moment we did, a basket of fake flowers came flying at us. Not sliding down gently, not dropping from a shelf. Flying at us as if someone had been standing at the top of the stairs and thrown it directly down toward us. It scared us half to death. I remember that clearly. The shock of it. The instant panic. The way we turned and got downstairs as fast as we could. We did not stand there trying to be brave. We did not go up to investigate. We ran. There was no way we were staying there a second longer than we had to. The men tried to laugh it off, of course. Our fathers chuckled and told us it probably just fell off something in the attic. That sounds reasonable if you say it fast enough. But it did not feel like that to us. It did not feel like something had simply tipped over. It felt aimed. It felt like it came right at us. And whether that was because of the angle, the speed, or just the terror of the moment, I still remember feeling certain that someone, or something, did not want us snooping around up there. At that point, there was absolutely no way we were going to try the elevator. That was finished. Whatever small excitement we had about a private house elevator disappeared after that. We were already unsettled by the portrait and the attic incident. The stories about it moving at night did not help. By then, even walking through the house felt different. It no longer felt like an interesting old mansion. It felt like a place with moods. A place that noticed when you were there. A place that had limits. We ended up deciding that the old lady of the house did not want us snooping through her things. That was the joke, anyway. But it was one of those jokes people make because the truth feels too strange to say directly. We laughed, but I do not think any of us fully believed it was just an accident. The company kept the house for about another 6 months after that. Eventually, they sold it. I do not know whether they sold it because of all the strange things happening there or because it simply stopped making financial sense. Maybe it was a little of both. But I do know they did not keep it forever, and I have always suspected the house had become more trouble than anyone wanted to admit. Even after all these years, my dad and I still sometimes talk about it. We have joked before that if we are ever back that way, we should drive by the house and maybe even stop to ask the current owners whether they still have wiring problems with the elevator. That line always makes us laugh because it is such an obvious way of saying, "Does your elevator still run by itself in the middle of the night?" But under the joke is real curiosity. We still wonder. We still think about that house and the things that happened in it. And honestly, I would love to know. I would love to know if the current owners have heard the elevator moving when no one is near it. I would love to know if they have found objects moved from where they left them. I would love to know if they have ever heard footsteps in the hall, or found signs of someone there when there was no one. I would especially love to know if they have ever gone up toward that attic and felt the same resistance we felt that day. There is something about stories like this that stays with you, not always because they were the most terrifying thing you ever experienced, but because they were just real enough, just strange enough, that they never quite leave your mind. When I think back on it now, what strikes me most is how gradual it all was. It did not start with some huge dramatic event. It started with small things. The elevator moving. The caretaker feeling watched. Missing supplies. Gardening gloves vanishing and then reappearing. Those things could all be dismissed one by one. But then came the footsteps. The muddy prints in the bathtub that ended with no explanation. Then the attic incident. It was as if the house kept pushing the line a little farther each time, moving from strange to unsettling to genuinely frightening. That is one reason the story feels believable to me even now. Real experiences like this rarely start with the biggest, wildest moment. They build. They gather. They create a pattern slowly enough that the people involved keep trying to explain them away. That is exactly what happened here. My dad did not wake the first time the elevator moved and declare the house haunted. He checked the wiring in his mind and went back to bed. The caretaker did not lose one item and decide ghosts were playing tricks on her. She just got annoyed. Only when things piled up did the house begin to feel different. And it did feel different. Even though I only spent that one afternoon there, I could feel it. The house had a presence to it. Not necessarily something evil, but something strong. Something that made you feel like you were not simply walking through an empty building. The portrait added to that feeling, of course. So did knowing the original owner had died and left everything behind. Houses absorb the lives of the people who live in them, especially houses that old and that full of memory. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, it is hard not to feel that in a place like that. I have often wondered about the family who originally lived there. I think about the woman in the portrait. I think about her daughter with polio and the elevator added for her. That detail matters to me because it tells you this was not just some grand old house. It was a family home shaped by love and necessity. Someone cared enough to change the structure of the house to make life easier for their child. That makes the place feel deeply personal. It makes the haunting, if that is what it was, feel less random. More tied to real lives once lived there. Maybe that is why I always imagined the old lady of the house not wanting people snooping around. It was silly and light-hearted when we said it as teenagers, but part of me still wonders whether something of her remained. Not necessarily in a frightening way, but in a protective one. The furniture was still there. The portrait still hung in place. The elevator still ran through the house. Everything about it suggested that the family's presence had never fully disappeared, even after death. That does not explain the muddy footprints, of course. That is still one of the strangest parts to me. If you asked me what detail from the story sticks with me the most, it might be that. The idea of my dad and Larry hearing what sounded like a person running to the bathroom, getting up with a gun because they thought there was an intruder, and then finding only muddy footprints leading into the tub and nowhere else. That is the kind of detail that lingers. Because it is so specific. Too specific to feel like a vague story people invented later. It has the awkward weirdness of something that really happened and made no sense at all. The attic incident stays with me too, of course. Mostly because I experienced that one myself. It is one thing to hear stories from adults about something strange happening in a house. It is another thing entirely to open a door and have an object come flying at you. Could there be a normal explanation for it? Maybe. Maybe something really had been balanced poorly and fell at exactly the wrong moment. But it did not feel like that then, and it still does not feel like that in my memory. It felt intentional. It felt like a warning. And once you feel something that strongly in the moment, it becomes part of the story forever. As time has passed, I think about the house a little differently than I did back then. As a teenager, the story was exciting and creepy and fun to retell. It was a ghost story attached to my dad's work trips, and that alone made it memorable. But now, as an adult, I think more about the men who had to live there week after week, trying to act normal, trying to sleep, trying to work, all while odd things happened around them. I think about the caretaker who had to clean there, sometimes alone, feeling watched. I think about how quickly a place can go from convenient to uncomfortable when it stops feeling empty. I also think about how easy it is for companies and practical people to dismiss unsettling things. At first, the house was just a smart purchase. A furnished old mansion at a low price. Plenty of space. Even an elevator. It made perfect sense on paper. But paper does not tell you what a place feels like at 2 in the morning when the elevator starts moving by itself. Paper does not tell you about muddy footprints that lead into a tub and stop. Paper does not tell you whether a house wants to be left alone. That is what makes old houses so fascinating to me. They are never just walls and rooms. They are layers of other lives. They hold habits, grief, love, illnesses, arguments, routines, and memories. Some people believe those things stay only in our minds. Others think they linger in the places themselves. I am not sure exactly where I stand, but I know this. Some houses feel lived in even when no one is there. That house felt that way. Even after all these years, I can picture parts of it clearly. The giant portrait. The stairs. The sense of height and space. The attic door. The feeling of not wanting to try the elevator. The quick rush of fear when the flowers came flying down. The nervous laughter after. The grown men brushing off things they could not explain. The half-joking talk about ghosts that was not really a joke at all. That is probably why the story has lasted in my family. Not because it was the most terrifying thing ever, but because so many different people experienced different pieces of it. It was not just one person imagining something. My dad heard the elevator. The caretaker lost things and found them moved. My dad and Larry heard the footsteps and saw the muddy prints. I experienced the attic incident. All of those things together form a pattern that is hard to ignore. If we ever do go back there, I do not know if I would actually be brave enough to ask for a tour. Part of me would love to see the house again. Part of me would love to know whether the portrait is still there, whether the elevator still works, whether the attic still feels the same. But another part of me thinks some places are better left in memory. Memory softens things a little. It lets the mystery remain. Walking back into that house now might explain everything. Or it might explain nothing and make it all feel strange again. Either way, I know one thing for sure. That old house in Mariana never felt like just a company house. It was supposed to be a practical answer to a travel problem. A cheaper alternative to hotel rooms. A second home for engineers working far from home. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. A place of late-night noises, missing objects, nervous jokes, and stories that stayed with us long after the company sold it. And even now, whenever my dad and I talk about it, we still come back to the same question. Was it really old wiring? Or was someone else still using that elevator? Back in high school, I went over to a friend's house after school one afternoon. At the time, it felt like a completely normal thing to do. We were in school together, and like a lot of teenagers, we would sometimes hang out after classes ended, talk, listen to music, watch TV, and waste time the way kids do when they are not in any hurry to get home. I did not think there was anything unusual waiting for me that day. I had no reason to think I would leave her house feeling completely different than when I arrived. But that was the day everything changed for me. Up until then, I did not really believe in ghosts. I am not saying I had never heard ghost stories before. Of course I had. Almost everyone grows up hearing strange stories from friends, cousins, neighbors, or people at school who swear they saw something they could not explain. But I had always been the kind of person who thought there had to be some other answer. If a light flickered, there was probably bad wiring. If a door moved, there was probably a draft. If someone said something invisible was in their house, I usually thought they were either imagining it, exaggerating it, or just trying to scare somebody. So when my friend started talking to me about a ghost in her house, my first reaction was not fear. My first reaction was that she was being dramatic. We were in her room when she brought it up. I do not remember exactly what we had been talking about before that, but I remember the feeling of the moment very clearly. We were just sitting there like normal teenagers, and then she suddenly started telling me that there was a ghost in her house. She said it in a serious way too, not like she was joking around or trying to tell a campfire story. She genuinely wanted me to know. I remember looking at her and thinking she sounded crazy. That is honestly what I thought. I did not want to be rude, but inside I was absolutely not buying it. Then she started telling me the things that happened there. She said the ghost, or whatever it was, would mess with things in her room. It would change the TV channels. It would change the radio stations. And then she told me something that sounded even more ridiculous to me at the time. She said it would rip the cat pictures on her wall. These were not framed pictures or expensive art. They were pictures she had cut out of a calendar and hung up around her room because she loved cats. To me, that made the whole story sound even less believable. A ghost that changes channels and tears cat pictures? It sounded more like a prank than anything supernatural. I remember listening to her and thinking there had to be a simple explanation for everything she was saying. Maybe the TV was old. Maybe the radio did not work right. Maybe her little brother, if she had one, had messed with the pictures. Maybe she just wanted to scare me. I did not know exactly what explanation I believed, but I knew I did not believe ghosts. At least not then. After she finished telling me all that, we decided to watch some TV. At first, it still felt normal. She picked up the remote and turned the TV on. She changed it to a channel she wanted to watch. We sat there looking at the screen, and then the channel changed. Just like that. It did not fade out or lose signal the way a bad TV might. It switched. She immediately changed it back. Then it changed again. She put it back on the same station one more time, and once again it switched to something else. I will admit, that got my attention. Not enough to make me suddenly believe in a ghost, but enough to make me stop smiling to myself about her story. It was strange. I watched her put it back on the original station more than once, and every time it went somewhere else. The timing of it made it feel deliberate, almost like someone was waiting for her to choose the channel and then changing it on purpose. Still, even then, I did not accept what she was saying. I told myself she had to be doing something with the remote. Maybe she had another remote hidden somewhere. Maybe she knew some trick with the TV. Maybe there was another television nearby and the signal was bouncing somehow. I do not know. The point is, I was looking for ways to explain it. I did not want to jump straight to believing something strange was in the room with us. So yes, it freaked me out a little, but not enough to change my mind. I still thought she was somehow messing with me. After the TV thing stopped being fun, she said forget it, and decided she wanted to listen to music instead. So she went to turn on her radio. The same thing started happening there too. She picked a station. It changed. She put it back. It changed again. She tried one more time, and once again it switched away from what she wanted to hear. That started to bother me more than the TV had. A television can be connected to all kinds of things. A remote can be used from somewhere else. The signal can do weird things. But the radio changing stations again and again right in front of me made it harder to keep telling myself it was all some trick. Not impossible, maybe, but harder. It also added to the strange feeling in the room. It was like whatever was happening did not want us to do anything normally. We could not settle on a channel. We could not settle on a station. Every time she tried to do something ordinary, it got interrupted. She started getting frustrated. That part felt real to me too. If she had been trying to scare me with some prank, she was doing a very good job of pretending to be annoyed. She did not look amused. She did not look like someone setting up a joke and waiting for the punchline. She looked angry, like this had happened before, and she was tired of it. She was complaining that nothing was working out. No watching TV. No listening to music. Everything kept changing on us. Then she got down on the floor and started digging under her bed. That seemed random to me at first. I did not know what she was doing, and honestly I thought maybe she was just trying to distract me or continue the act in some new way. Most kids throw all kinds of junk under their beds, so it was not strange to see her reaching underneath and moving stuff around. That part was normal enough. I just sat there watching her, and still trying to decide whether I was being fooled somehow. Then I heard something rip. It was a quick sound, but clear enough. I remember immediately feeling irritated more than scared. I thought, great, now she is really trying hard to sell this to me. In my mind, she was probably reaching under the bed and ripping something herself so she could claim the ghost had done it. I was not impressed. I had already seen the TV and radio thing, and I still was not ready to believe. So my first reaction to that ripping sound was not panic. It was suspicion. Then she looked up at me from where she was digging under the bed. She told me to look at the cat pictures. I remember that moment very clearly because the way she said it was not playful. She looked serious. She looked almost upset. For a second I still thought it had to be part of her act, but something about her face made me pay attention. So I turned and started looking around the room at the pictures she had taped or pinned on the walls. At first, everything looked normal. I looked at one wall, then another. I saw the cat pictures hanging where they had been. Nothing looked different. I think for a second I even started feeling smug again, like maybe I was about to prove to myself that she was making it up. Then I looked at the one behind my head. It was ripped in half. Not bent. Not hanging crooked. Ripped. That was the moment everything changed for me. I almost screamed when I saw it. I know that sounds dramatic, but that is exactly how it felt. It hit me all at once. I had been sitting there the entire time. I had not seen anyone come near that picture. I had not heard anyone behind me. No one had entered the room. There were only two people in there, me and her. The picture had not been torn when I came in. I would have noticed that. And yet now it was split right down the middle as if someone had taken hold of it and ripped it apart. That was the first moment I truly felt fear in that room. Before then, I had been skeptical. After that, I no longer knew what to think. The fear did not come from the picture itself, because obviously a torn calendar page is not terrifying on its own. It came from the fact that I could not explain how it happened. It came from realizing that maybe my friend had not been lying to me after all. And then I saw something else. Across the room there was a mirror. When I looked into it, I saw a dark shadow. I still remember that image because it happened so fast, and yet it stayed in my mind. I did not see a face. I did not see clear features. I did not see some fully formed person standing there. I saw a dark shadow in the reflection. That was enough. After everything that had already happened, That shadow did not look like ordinary darkness to me. It looked like something there in the room with us. The second I saw it, I was done. I did not stay calm. I did not stand there trying to be brave. I did not keep asking questions. I ran. I took off down her stairs as fast as I could. I do not remember carefully leaving the room or acting polite. I just wanted out of that house. I wanted away from that room, away from that mirror, away from whatever had changed channels, changed stations, and ripped that picture in half while I was sitting there. All the skepticism I had walked in with was gone. Fear had replaced it completely. I remember telling her I was calling my parents to come get me. That was all I wanted in that moment. I did not care if I looked childish. I did not care if she thought I was overreacting. I did not care what her family thought. I just wanted to leave. My body was running on pure panic by then. It is strange how fast your mind can change when something happens right in front of you that you cannot explain. 1 minute you are sitting there thinking someone is crazy. The next minute you are at the bottom of their stairs trying to get home as quickly as possible. And I never went back to her house again. Not once. That day changed something in me. Before that day, I did not believe in ghosts. After that day, I did. Now, when I look back on it, I think one of the reasons it affected me so much was because I had gone in completely unbelieving. If I had already been someone who believed in every scary story, maybe I would have reacted differently. Maybe I would have expected something strange. But I did not. I went in thinking my friend was making things up. I was ready to dismiss everything she said. So when the events in that room kept building one on top of another, it hit me harder than it would have otherwise. First it was her story. Then the TV. Then the radio. Then the ripping sound. Then the picture behind me, torn in half. Then the dark shadow in the mirror. Each thing alone, maybe, could have been explained away. That is what I kept trying to do while it was happening. A TV can act up. A radio can act up. A picture can get torn somehow. A mirror can reflect strange shadows depending on the light. But when all of those things happened in that short amount of time, one right after another, in a room where my friend had already told me there was something there, it stopped feeling like coincidence. I think about my friend sometimes and wonder how long she had been dealing with that in her house before I ever came over. If she was telling the truth, and I fully believe now that she was, then she had probably been living with that kind of thing for a while. That means what I experienced in one afternoon was only a small part of what she had known all along. At the time, I thought she was crazy. I honestly did. I probably even felt a little embarrassed for her while she was telling me those stories. But later I felt bad for doubting her so completely. She was not making it up. She was trying to explain something she had been experiencing, and I walked into her room already certain she was lying. What stands out to me the most now is how normal the room looked. That may sound strange, but it matters. Nothing about the room screamed haunted the second I walked in. It looked like a teenager's room. The cat pictures on the wall. The TV. The radio. The usual mess and stuff under the bed. It was ordinary. That made what happened there even worse. If the room had already felt creepy from the start, maybe I would have thought my imagination was playing tricks on me. But it did not. It looked normal, right up until the point where it did not feel normal anymore. I also think about the torn picture a lot. That was the thing that broke my resistance more than anything else. The TV and the radio could still be blamed on hidden remotes or old electronics. But the picture behind my head was different. It was too close to me. Too direct. Too impossible to ignore. It was almost like whatever was in that room wanted me to know it was real. Not my friend. Me. It was one thing for her to tell me stories. It was another thing for me to sit there and become part of it. That is what really frightened me. It did not stay something I was hearing about. It became something happening around me. And then there was the shadow. Sometimes I still ask myself if I could have mistaken an ordinary reflection for something else because I was already scared. Fear does strange things to the mind. It sharpens some details and distorts others. So yes, I have wondered that. But even when I give myself all the room in the world to question my own memory, I still come back to the same truth. I saw a dark shadow in that mirror right after seeing the torn picture, and in that moment I knew I needed to get out. Maybe another person would have stayed longer. Maybe they would have tried to test things. Maybe they would have called for the ghost, asked questions, tried to prove something, or looked more closely at the mirror. But I was in high school. I was scared. And once fear hit me, I was not interested in investigating. I just wanted my parents. I wanted safety. I wanted to be somewhere normal again, in a place where televisions stayed on the channels you put them on, and pictures on walls did not tear themselves in half. That afternoon became one of those stories I could never laugh off afterward. Afterward, any time someone talked about ghosts, I no longer rolled my eyes the same way. I could not. I had experienced something I could not explain, and once that happens, your view changes. You do not have to become someone who believes every strange story, but you lose the comfort of total disbelief. You become aware that there are moments in life that do not fit neatly into ordinary explanations. What I remember most clearly is the feeling of my confidence disappearing. At first, I was certain I knew better than my friend. Then I was certain she was tricking me. Then I was uncertain. Then I was terrified. That shift happened in one afternoon. It is strange how quickly belief can change when it is forced by something personal. Before that, ghosts were just stories other people told. After that, the idea of a ghost was attached to a place, a room, a ripped picture, a shadow in a mirror, and the feeling of running down a staircase in panic. I can still picture little parts of it clearly. The room. The cat pictures. My friend kneeling by the bed, digging underneath it. The ripping sound. Her telling me to look around. Me scanning the walls and not seeing anything wrong at first. Then finding the one behind my head split in half. Then glancing toward the mirror. Then that shadow. Then the feeling that the air in the room had changed completely. It is funny how memory works. I do not remember every word we said. I do not remember what I was wearing. I do not remember what exact TV show we tried to watch or what music station she wanted to hear. But I remember the important pieces like they stayed burned into my mind. Fear does that. It chooses its own details and saves them. Part of me has wondered over the years whether my friend ever got used to living there. Some people who live with strange things in a house long enough develop a weird sort of acceptance. They complain, they get annoyed, they get scared now and then, but they also keep going because what else are they supposed to do? It was her house. It was not as simple as leaving. I left and never went back, but she had to stay there. That thought bothers me. Because if what I saw in one visit was real, then she had probably spent many nights and many afternoons dealing with it when no one else was around. That would be exhausting. Even if the ghost was not violent, even if it only messed with electronics and tore pictures, that kind of constant presence would wear you down. Every time the TV changed, every time the radio switched, every time a picture got ruined, you would be reminded that you were not fully in control of your own space. That alone would be disturbing. A bedroom should be one of the safest rooms in a house, especially for a teenager. It is your private place, your comfort zone, your own little world. If something in that room keeps interfering with your things, it is like your personal space no longer belongs completely to you. That might be why my friend sounded so frustrated more than scared at first. She was angry that nothing was working. Angry that she could not even sit and watch TV or listen to music without the thing interrupting her. At the time I did not appreciate that. I was too busy not believing her. But now I understand it better. If she had gone through that again and again, the frustration would make sense. Sometimes people who live with strange activity stop reacting with pure fear all the time and start reacting with irritation. That does not make it less frightening. It just means they are tired of it. I also think about how strongly I rejected the idea in the beginning. Maybe that is normal. Maybe most people do that until they experience something themselves. It is easy to think there is always an explanation when the story belongs to someone else. It becomes much harder when it happens to you. That is why I never make fun of people's stories the way I once might have. I may not believe every single claim I hear, but I also know better than to assume everyone is lying or imagining things. Sometimes people really do go through something they cannot explain. And that was me that day. The biggest reason I know I was not just working myself up is because the fear did not start before anything happened. It started after enough had happened that I could no longer explain it. If I had gone into that room already convinced it was haunted, maybe I would question myself more now. But I did not. I went and completely closed off to the idea. The fear grew only when the evidence in front of me piled up beyond what I could easily dismiss. I remember the drive home too, though not every detail of it. Mostly I remember trying to calm down, and still feeling shaken long after I had left the house. Sometimes when something scary happens, the fear peaks in the moment, and then fades quickly once you are safe. This was not like that. I stayed scared. My mind kept replaying it. I kept seeing that torn picture and that dark shape in the mirror. I kept hearing her tell me to look at the cat pictures. I kept thinking about how sure I had been that she was lying, and how wrong I had been. That is probably why I never went back. It was not just that I was scared of seeing something again. It was also that I did not want to put myself in a situation where I would have to face that feeling again. Once you have had one experience that shakes your whole way of thinking, you do not rush to repeat it. At least I did not. I wanted distance from that room and that house and whatever was in it. And yet, even though I never went back, the story stayed with me. It became one of those memories that sits right at the edge of your life, always ready to return when the subject comes up. If someone tells a ghost story, I think of that room. If someone says they do not believe in ghosts, I think of how sure I used to be. If someone says electronics kept changing on their own or something on the wall moved, I remember how quickly my own certainty fell apart. The strange thing is that nothing truly dramatic happened in the way horror movies show things. No furniture flew across the room. No one was scratched. No ghost appeared fully in front of us. There was no screaming voice out of nowhere. And still, it scared me more than a lot of bigger stories would have. Why? Because it felt personal and immediate. Because it happened in a simple ordinary room. Because it used normal things, a TV, a radio, cat pictures, and turned them strange. Because it made me, not just my friend, part of it. The torn picture behind my head felt almost like a message. Like something saying, "You don't believe? Look now." That is what made it unforgettable. Over time, I have tried to look back on it calmly and ask myself every practical question I can. Could the TV have been controlled somehow? Maybe. Could the radio have been acting up? Possibly. Could the picture have already been torn and I just had not noticed? I really do not think so. Could the shadow in the mirror have been caused by lighting? Maybe, but it did not feel like that. And once I put all those things together in the order they happened, I still end up in the same place. Something was wrong in that room. Something was there. Call it a ghost, call it a spirit, call it an unexplained presence, call it whatever you want. I only know I walked in not believing and walked out believing. That is the truth. I think what changed me most was not just fear, but humility. I realized that I did not know everything. I realized that not every strange story can be dismissed just because it sounds silly at first. My friend had trusted me enough to tell me what was happening in her house, and I had instantly judged her. Then her house showed me I was wrong. In a strange way, that experience taught me to listen differently afterward, not only to ghost stories, but to people in general. Sometimes what sounds unbelievable is true. Sometimes another person is trying to explain something as best they can, and because it falls outside your experience, you assume they must be mistaken. I do not do that so quickly anymore. And if I am being honest, there is still one part that makes me uneasy even now. It is not the TV. It is not the radio. It is not even really the ripped picture. It is the shadow. Because the shadow made it feel like all the other things had a source. Without the shadow, I might still have talked myself into believing the room had electrical problems and that the picture tearing was some bizarre coincidence. But the moment I looked into that mirror and saw something dark there, everything else connected into one terrifying whole. That was the moment my body knew before my mind fully caught up. That was the moment I ran. And that was the day I started believing in ghosts. Not because I wanted to. Not because someone convinced me with a story. But because I saw enough with my own eyes that I could not go back to the easy disbelief I had before. I can still see myself at the top of those stairs, heart pounding, desperate to get out. I can still remember the feeling of wanting my parents in a way that suddenly made me feel much younger than high school. Fear strips you down like that. It takes away the cool attitude, the confidence, the jokes, the trying to act grown, and leaves you wanting only safety. That is exactly how I felt. And once I got out of that house, I never wanted to step inside it again. Some people might say I should have gone back later to prove it to myself one way or another. Maybe they are right. Maybe if I had gone back, I would have seen nothing and convinced myself it had all been some strange mix of old electronics, nerves, and coincidence. Or maybe I would have seen even more and never forgotten it. I will never know, because I chose not to go back. At the time, that was the only choice I could make. So that afternoon remains exactly what it was. A single visit. A room with cat pictures on the wall. A friend I thought was crazy. A TV that would not stay on the right channel. A radio that would not stay on the right station. A ripping sound. A picture behind my head, suddenly torn in half. A dark shadow in a mirror. And me running down the stairs, calling my parents, and never coming back. That was enough. More than enough. That one afternoon changed my mind for good, and to this day, whenever I think back on when I first started to believe in ghosts, I do not think of a story someone told me. I think of that house, that room, that mirror, and the exact moment disbelief turned into fear.